Okay, good morning, everybody, wherever it is you are listening to this. And this is Chapter 10, Externalities. And this is, I'm generally offering this chapter after the market chapter, Chapter 4. And the reason why I'm doing that is that externalities provide a bit of pause to the looking at markets and market equilibrium and the glories of the market. Externalities gives us a little bit of pause. Okay, now we can refer back to one of the main ideas of economics from chapter 1, and this is, I believe, its main idea 7, that government action can sometimes improve upon market outcomes. So sometimes markets can fail to allocate resources efficiently. And we'll find that very much in this chapter. And it looks at this chapter looks at not just the impact of the markets upon private individuals, but the impact of markets upon society, aka the third party. Now, this chapter also is, given that we have these externalities, government policies can, sometimes improve the market's allocation, and we'll look a little bit at the pros and cons of that. And number 3, what kinds of policies are likely to work best and under which circumstances? Now, a definition. So, an externality is the uncompensated impacts of a person's action upon the well being of a bystander. So it's a market failure because it doesn't take into consideration the bystander and or the third party. And there can be 2 types of externalities. Number 1, the impact on the bystander is adverse or negative. And number 2, the impact on the bystander is beneficial. So negative externalities, some examples, exhaust from automobiles and or barking dogs. These things both have adverse impacts upon the third party, not necessarily the dog owner or the automobile driver, but the person who's hearing the barking dog and smelling the exhaust from the automobile. Now, positive, there's beneficial. So people who restore historic buildings, research into new technologies. These are actions that can benefit the third party, benefit society as a whole. Now, another example of a positive externality is a vaccine. And this case, it's a negative externality because if you decline to be vaccinated, that is going to impose a cost on another person. Otherwise, you might get measles, for example. And this is entirely due to folks who are not getting a measles vaccine. So we all agree that declining to get a vaccination is a negative externality. So now I'm a little bit on the supply and demand, and a little bit of a recap or review. Now, we didn't cover this particular chapter in welfare economics, but the recap is pretty simple and straightforward. The demand curve is the value to consumers, the price they're willing to pay for different quantities. The supply curve is the cost of suppliers and the cost to those suppliers of different quantities. The equilibrium quantity and price is where supply and demand meets. And like it says there, it maximizes the sum of consumer and producer surplus. So where the two cross is the efficient point. And here is the market for aluminum. For example, the market takes into consideration the private cost and the private value of consumers and producers. And equilibrium is that price that gives us, that clears the market. There is no surplus or shortage, at that market, and and maximizes value. It's very good. But of course, there is no externalities in this case. Now, a little bit more of a deep dive into negative externalities. It's a cost to society of producing the good, and that cost is larger than the cost to the good producers. Um, so it's kind of a price that is to be paid not by the producer but by society as a whole. And we can see a cute little picture here. And the guy is saying, all I can say is that if being a leading manufacturer means being a leading polluter, then so be it. And unfortunately, that's a point of view that a lot of firms have. It's just kind of the cost of doing business. Um, but society doesn't exactly appreciate that cost. And so there's methods of trying to deal with it. But unfortunately, the producer, him or herself, does not have the incentive to deal with it. Now, furthermore, a negative externality is a social cost, and it's an addition to the cost that the producer bears for making the product. It could be aluminum, it could be cars, it could be really almost anything. Now, graphically, and we'll see this in a second, the social cost curve is above or to the left of the supply curve, and it takes into account the external costs imposed upon society. And here we have the graph. We have the social cost that is to the left of the regular supply curve. And so given this social cost, as you can see there, if the producer took the social cost into consideration, the price would be greater and the quantity would be less than in private market equilibrium. Okay, so with negative externalities, the optimum quantity would be smaller than equilibrium, and that would maximize total welfare not just to the private individual but to society as a whole. Now, who is going to step in to make this correction if the individual producers are not willing to? Well, that falls upon the third party, aka the government. And when the government seeks to correct that market failure, the government is in essence internalizing the externality. And they are altering incentives so that people take account of their external effects upon their action. Somehow in like a parent and a child, if the child is hurting somebody else, the parent is going to, as the third party, is going to punish the child for the actions upon that third party, so that the child will not do it again if he or she knows that that punishment is going to happen. Now, for a positive externality, like education, for example, while the benefit of education is private, there are also externalities to society in the form of better government, lower crime rates, higher productivity, and wages. So now the social value is greater than the private value, and the social value curve is going to be above the demand curve or to the right of the demand curve. And we can see here from the graph, that is exactly what's happening. The social value curve is indeed above the demand curve. And so therefore, our next slide, the socially optimal quantity is greater than the market equilibrium quantity. If government is to intervene here, they're going to want to have people produce more of the positive externality. And so they may want to do a subsidy, whereas in the case of the negative, the optimal thing would be some sort of a tax. All right, let's see what our next slide is. Okay, just to review a little bit, with negative externalities, markets produce a larger quantity than is socially desirable. If the government were to step in, the government would seek to reduce that quantity, and one way to do that is via a tax. And for positive externalities, the market produces a smaller quantity in the private sense then is socially desirable. The optimal policy is for the government to somehow get them to produce more, and so that would be a subsidy. Okay, that is it for this first section.